The stranger rode into Taylor, Arizona territory, on a day so hot the vultures had taken to the shade, and Isaac Randall figured if he didn't find water soon, he'd be joining whatever carrion they were waiting on. The year was 1878, and the land stretched out before him like a promise written in dust and desperation. But he'd bought it sight unseen from a railroad office in St. Louis, and now he was here to claim what was his. The town itself consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, a church that looked like it might blow over in the next strong wind, and a scattering of buildings that seemed to exist purely out of stubbornness. Isaac dismounted outside the general store, his legs stiff from 3 days of hard riding, and tied his horse to the hitching post. The animal's flanks were slick with sweat, and he made a mental note to get him watered before anything else. Inside the store, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles looked up from behind the counter. His face was weathered like old leather, creased with lines that spoke of too many years squinting into the sun. "Help you?" the man asked, his voice carrying the flat vowels of someone who'd been out here long enough to forget where he'd come from. "Name's Isaac Randall. Just bought the old Henderson place, about 5 miles north of here. Looking to get some supplies and maybe some directions." The storekeeper's expression shifted, something between surprise and what might have been pity flickering across his features. The Henderson place, that'd be the ranch bordering the Graves property. That's right. Isaac pulled out a list he'd made while still in St. Louis, back when he'd thought he knew what he was doing. "I'll need flour, salt, coffee, beans, some dried meat if you've got it, enough to get me through a few weeks while I get settled." "You know about the widow, then?" the storekeeper asked, already moving to gather the items. Isaac paused. "What widow?" The man stopped, turning back with raised eyebrows. "Beatrice Graves. Runs the ranch next to yours." "Well, runs might be generous. Her husband died about 8 months back, left her with more land than she can manage and debts she can't pay. The bank's been circling like wolves." Something in Isaac's chest tightened. He'd come west to start fresh, to build something with his own 2 hands away from the factory smoke of St. Louis and the memories of a war he'd rather forget. He hadn't counted on neighbors, let alone a widow struggling to hold onto her land. "That's unfortunate," he said carefully, "but I've got my own concerns. Just need to get my place in order." The storekeeper nodded but didn't look convinced. "You'll be meeting her soon enough anyway. Her land shares a water source with yours, the only decent creek for miles. You'll be seeing each other regular, whether you plan on it or not." Isaac paid for his supplies, loaded them onto his horse, and rode north following the storekeeper's directions. The land rose and fell in gentle swells, covered in scrub brush and dotted with mesquite trees. In the distance, he could make out mountains, their peaks still holding onto the memory of last winter's snow. It was harsh country, unforgiving, but there was a beauty to it that made his chest ache with something he couldn't quite name. The Henderson place, when he found it, was worse than he'd imagined. The house was a small adobe structure with a roof that had partially caved in. The barn was in better shape but not by much, and the corral fence had more gaps than boards. A windmill stood silent, its blades hanging at an odd angle. He stood in what passed for the yard, surveying his purchase, and wondered if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. He spent the rest of that day and most of the next making the house habitable. He patched the roof with spare boards he found in the barn, swept out the worst of the dust and debris, and managed to get the old stove working well enough to heat coffee. By the second evening, he was exhausted, filthy, and starting to question every decision that had led him to this point. That's when he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Isaac stepped out of the house, squinting into the late afternoon sun. A rider was coming up the path, sitting straight in the saddle despite the obvious fatigue of the horse. As they drew closer, he could make out more details. A woman, wearing men's trousers and a shirt that had seen better days, her dark hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat. She reined in her horse a respectful distance away and dismounted. Even covered in trail dust, there was something striking about her. She had dark eyes that assessed him with frank curiosity, and a face that would have been beautiful if it weren't so drawn with exhaustion and worry. "You must be the new owner," she said, her voice lower than he'd expected, rough around the edges like she wasn't used to using it much. "I'm Beatrice Graves. My land borders yours to the east. Isaac Randall." He stepped forward, extending his hand. She took it without hesitation, her grip firm and her palm calloused. "The storekeeper mentioned you." "I'm sure he did." A ghost of something that might have been humor touched her lips. Small town. Not much else to talk about except other people's troubles. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, probably around his own age of 28 or so. But she had the kind of weariness that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with hardship. "I wanted to introduce myself," she continued, "and let you know about the creek. It runs between our properties, and we'll need to work together to keep it clear. My husband and Mr. Henderson had an agreement about maintaining it." "That seems reasonable," Isaac said. Beatrice nodded, but her eyes had gone distant, focused on something he couldn't see. "I also wanted to warn you about the fence line on the western edge of your property. It's in bad shape, and my cattle have been getting through. I've been trying to repair it, but I haven't had the time or the materials. If you're planning to run any stock, you'll want to fix it. I appreciate the warning. I'm planning to start with horses, actually. I've got some experience with breaking and training them, thought there might be a market for good mounts out here." For the first time, something like genuine interest sparked in her eyes. "There is. The Army's always looking for horses, and the ranches around here too. It's smart thinking." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the desert wind whistling between them. Isaac found himself noticing details he shouldn't, the way the fading light caught in her hair, the proud set of her shoulders despite whatever burden she was carrying. "I should get back," Beatrice said finally. "I've got animals to feed before dark. But if you need anything, if you have questions about the land or the area, my place is about 3 miles east. Just follow the creek." "Thank you. That's kind of you." She mounted her horse with the easy grace of someone who'd been riding since childhood. "We're neighbors, Mr. Randall. Out here, that means something. Or at least it should." He watched her ride away, sitting tall in the saddle despite her obvious exhaustion, and felt something shift inside his chest. He tried to tell himself it was just sympathy, neighborly concern, but he'd never been good at lying to himself. The next few days passed in a blur of hard work. Isaac repaired the roof completely, fixed the windmill, and started clearing out the barn. The physical labor felt good, honest, a way to quiet the restless thoughts that had plagued him since the war. He'd been at Gettysburg, had seen things no man should see, and the doctors back east had suggested a change of scenery might help with the nightmares. So far, exhaustion was doing more than scenery, but he'd take what he could get. On the 4th day, he rode into town to purchase lumber for the corral repairs. The general store was busier this time, a handful of ranchers picking up supplies and swapping news. The conversation died when he walked in, and Isaac felt the weight of curious stares. "Mr. Randall," the storekeeper greeted him. "How's the place coming along? Getting there. I need lumber, nails, some tools if you've got them." As the storekeeper tallied up his order, one of the other men, a burly fellow with a gray-streaked beard, spoke up. "You're the one bought the Henderson place." "That's right. Name's Tom Fletcher. I run cattle about 10 miles south. You planning to fence your whole property?" Isaac sensed he was being tested somehow. Just the corrals and the areas I need for working horses. I'm not looking to block any traditional trails or water access. Fletcher nodded, seeming satisfied. Good. We've had trouble with some of the new folks coming in, thinking they can fence off everything and to hell with everyone else. Gets people riled up. I'm just here to make a living, not start trouble. Heard you met the Graves widow. Another man chimed in, younger, with a mean twist to his mouth. Pretty thing, even if she is struggling. Might be looking for a new husband if you're interested. The storekeeper shot the man a sharp look. That's enough, Pete. But Pete wasn't finished. I'm just saying, a woman alone like that, with all that land she can't manage, wouldn't be the worst thing if she found someone to take care of her, though the bank might get the land before any man gets the chance. Isaac felt his jaw tighten. Seems to me Mrs. Graves is managing just fine on her own, and her business is her own. Pete laughed. Touchy, ain't you? I wasn't suggesting anything improper, just stating facts. Isaac gathered his purchases and left, Pete's laughter following him out into the street. As he loaded the lumber onto the wagon he'd borrowed, he saw Beatrice herself coming out of what looked like a land office, her face pale and set. She didn't notice him, too focused on whatever thoughts were troubling her, and he watched as she mounted her horse and rode out of town at a pace just short of reckless. Something was wrong. Isaac found himself torn between minding his own business, as he'd planned, and the nagging feeling that a neighbor in trouble was his concern whether he liked it or not. In the end, his conscience won. He finished loading the wagon and headed back to his place, but his mind was on the woman with the proud shoulders and worried eyes. 2 days later, he was repairing the fence line she'd mentioned when he saw smoke rising from the direction of her property. Not the thin gray smoke of a chimney, but thick black columns that spoke of something seriously wrong. Without thinking, Isaac dropped his tools, ran to his horse, and rode hard toward the Graves ranch. He could see the fire from half a mile away. The barn was engulfed, flames leaping high into the afternoon sky. As he got closer, he could see Beatrice running back and forth with a bucket, her face streaked with soot and tears of frustration. She was alone, trying to fight a fire that was already beyond saving. Isaac dismounted at a run. The barn's gone. We need to wet down the house, keep it from spreading. She spun toward him, her eyes wild. The animals. I got the horses out, but there are chickens. I couldn't catch them all. They'll scatter or they won't, but you can't go in there. He grabbed her arm as she started toward the barn. It's too late. She struggled against him for a moment, then seemed to collapse, her strength giving out. I know, but I can't just watch it burn. Then help me save the house. That we can do. They worked together in desperate silence, hauling water from the creek, dousing the side of the house nearest the barn, stamping out embers that floated down like deadly snow. The heat was intense, driving them back again and again, but they kept at it until the barn finally collapsed in on itself with a roar of sparks and flame. When it was clear the house was safe, Beatrice sank down onto the ground, her back against the adobe wall, her face in her hands. Isaac stood awkwardly nearby, unsure what to do or say. He'd faced down Confederate soldiers without flinching, but a weeping woman unmanned him completely. I'm sorry, she said finally, her voice muffled. You shouldn't have to see me like this. You've got nothing to apologize for. What happened? She lowered her hands, looking at the smoking ruins. I don't know. I was in the house and I heard the horses screaming. By the time I got out there, the whole thing was going up. It happened so fast. Isaac studied the remains of the barn, what little could be seen through the smoke. Could have been a lightning strike, though I don't recall a storm, or maybe a lantern got knocked over. I'm always careful with the lanterns. Her voice was flat, drained of emotion. But I suppose it doesn't matter now. It's gone, and I don't have the money to rebuild. He sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. You've got insurance, she laughed, a bitter sound. Do I look like I have money for insurance? The bank already holds the mortgage on the land. My husband took out loans to expand the herd, and then he died before any of it paid off. I've been selling cattle just to make the payments, and now this. I'm sorry, that's a hard situation. Hard. She repeated the word like she was tasting it. Yes, I suppose that's one way to put it. Mr. Randall, I'm about to lose everything. The bank's given me until the end of next month to catch up on my payments, and I was already barely managing. Without the barn, I can't even keep what stock I have left properly. It's over. The defeat in her voice cut him deeper than he expected. Isaac had known her less than a week, had exchanged maybe 100 words with her, but the thought of her losing this place, of that proud spirit being broken, was intolerable. "What if you had help?" he heard himself say. She turned to look at him, her eyes red-rimmed from smoke and tears. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're neighbors. We share that creek, that fence line. It would make sense for us to help each other out. I could help you rebuild, and in return, maybe you could teach me more about running a ranch out here. I know horses, but I don't know this land." "Mr. Randall, I appreciate the kindness, but I can't pay you." "I'm not asking to be paid. I'm suggesting we help each other. That's what neighbors do, isn't it?" She studied his face for a long moment, and he tried not to squirm under that direct gaze. "Why would you do this?" "You don't know me." It was a fair question, and Isaac wasn't sure he had a good answer. "Maybe because when I came west, I told myself I was going to be a different man than I was back east. The kind of man who helps when he can. The kind of man who doesn't turn away from someone in need." "And what kind of man were you back east?" "The kind who saw too much death and didn't do enough living." He stood, brushing off his pants. "Look, you don't have to decide anything right now. You're in shock, you're exhausted, but the offer stands. We can start tomorrow if you want, or next week, or never. It's up to you." Beatrice stood as well, swaying slightly. He reached out to steady her, and she didn't pull away. "Thank you, Mr. Randall, for the help with the fire and for the offer. I need to think about it." "That's fair. You know where to find me." He rode home as the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and red that reminded him uncomfortably of the fire. His house felt emptier than usual that night, and he found himself thinking about Beatrice alone on her ranch, surveying the ruins of her barn, trying to figure out how to keep going. 3 days passed with no word from her. Isaac threw himself into his own work, telling himself it was none of his business if she was too proud to accept help. He'd made the offer, and that was all he could do. But he kept finding his eyes drawn toward the east, toward where her land lay, wondering how she was managing. On the 4th morning, he woke to find her horse tied outside his house and Beatrice herself sitting on his porch steps, looking like she hadn't slept in days. "I accept," she said without preamble. "Your offer. I accept. I need the help, and my pride isn't worth losing my home over." Isaac sat down beside her on the steps. "That must have been hard to say. You have no idea." She turned to look at him, and he was struck again by how young she was despite the weight she carried. "But I need you to understand something, Mr. Randall. I'm not looking for a husband. I'm not looking for charity. I want this to be a genuine partnership, neighbors helping each other. I'll pull my weight. I wouldn't expect anything less. And people are going to talk. A widow and an unmarried man working together, they'll make assumptions. Let them talk. I've weathered worse than gossip." She nodded slowly. "All right then. Where do we start?" They started with the immediate needs. Beatrice's horses needed shelter, so they rigged up a temporary structure using canvas and some of Isaac's lumber. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep the animals out of the worst of the weather. Then they moved on to assessing what she had left and what she needed. Working alongside her, Isaac discovered that Beatrice was tough as nails and twice as sharp. She could rope a steer, mend a fence, and handle a horse with the kind of easy competence that came from years of practice. She was also funny, with a dry wit that caught him off guard and made him laugh more than he had in years. "Your husband taught you all this?" he asked one afternoon as they were moving her remaining cattle to better pasture. "My father, actually. He ran a ranch in Texas before the war. He believed daughters should know everything sons knew. My mother thought he was crazy, but she went along with it." Beatrice's expression softened with memory. "He died when I was 16. Raiders. My mother followed him 6 months later. I think she just gave up. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. I met James, my husband, about a year after that. He was a drover passing through the town where I was working. He seemed like a good man, steady. We got married, came out here to make a fresh start." "Was he a good man, I mean?" Beatrice was quiet for a long moment. "He was decent. He didn't beat me, didn't drink too much. But he had big dreams and no patience for the small steps it takes to reach them. He bought too much land too fast, borrowed more than we could afford, always convinced the next season would be the one that made us rich. And then he got kicked by a horse and died 3 days later from the internal bleeding, and I was left with all his dreams and all his debts." The matter-of-fact way she said it made Isaac's chest ache. "That's a lot for one person to carry. We all carry things, Mr. Randall. I'm sure you've got your own burdens." He thought about the nightmares, the faces of boys he'd killed who were probably younger than him, the weight of surviving when so many hadn't. "I suppose I do." They worked in companionable silence after that, and Isaac found himself appreciating the lack of need to fill every moment with words. Beatrice didn't demand conversation, didn't pry, just existed alongside him in a way that felt surprisingly comfortable. As the weeks passed, they fell into a routine. Isaac would work on his own property in the mornings, then ride over to help Beatrice in the afternoons. They repaired fences, moved cattle, started planning for a new barn that would be smaller but more manageable than the one she'd lost. The work was hard, the days were long, and Isaac couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this content. He was also, he realized with some alarm, falling for her. It crept up on him gradually, in small moments he couldn't quite forget. The way she laughed when one of the chickens that had survived the fire pecked at his boots. The concentration on her face as she worked on repairing a saddle. The unconscious grace with which she moved, economical and sure. The way the evening light caught in her dark hair. He tried to ignore it, told himself he was being foolish. She'd been clear about not wanting a husband, and he had no business thinking of her as anything other than a neighbor and friend. But the heart didn't much care about should and shouldn't, and his heart was increasingly certain that Beatrice Graves was exactly what it had been searching for. One evening, about 6 weeks after the fire, they were finishing up work on the new barn. It was a modest structure but solid, and they'd managed to complete it mostly with salvaged materials and Isaac's lumber. As the sun set, they stood back to admire their work. "It's good," Beatrice said, and there was satisfaction in her voice. "Really good. I couldn't have done this without you." "We make a decent team," Isaac agreed. She turned to him, and something in her expression made his breath catch. "Isaac, can I ask you something?" It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice did things to his composure. "Of course." "Why are you really doing this? And please don't tell me it's just being neighborly. You've put weeks of work into my place. You've used your own materials, your own time. There has to be more to it than that." He could have deflected, could have made a joke or changed the subject. But there was something in her eyes, a vulnerability mixed with hope, that made him want to be honest. At first, it really was just about being neighborly, wanting to help someone who needed it, but somewhere along the way it became more than that. You became more than that. Isaac. His name was half warning, half plea. I know what you said. I know you're not looking for a husband, but I can't help how I feel, Beatrice. I think about you all the time. I look forward to seeing you every day. You make me laugh, you challenge me, you make me want to be better. And I know this probably isn't what you want to hear, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel it. She was quiet for so long he thought he'd ruined everything. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. Her palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid and real. I told myself I wouldn't do this, she said softly. After James died, I promised myself I'd never depend on a man again, that I'd stand on my own, succeed or fail by my own efforts. But then you came along with your steady hands and your kind eyes, and you made me want things I thought I'd given up on. What kind of things? Partnership, laughter, someone to share the burden with instead of carrying it alone, maybe even love, though that scares me more than I can say. Isaac's heart was hammering so hard he was sure she could hear it. It scares me too. I've seen what loss does to people. Hell, I've seen what it did to me after the war. The thought of caring about someone that much again, of having that much to lose, it terrifies me. But the thought of not trying, of letting fear win, that terrifies me more. She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'm a mess, Isaac. I'm stubborn and proud and carrying more debt than any sensible man would want to take on. I've got a ranch that's barely holding together and no guarantee I can make the bank payment even with all your help. You could do a lot better. I don't want better. I want you. The kiss happened so naturally he couldn't have said who moved first. One moment they were standing apart, hands clasped, and the next she was in his arms and his lips were on hers, and nothing in his life had ever felt so right. She tasted like dust and coffee and coming home, and when she pulled back, they were both breathing hard. That was probably a mistake, Beatrice said, but she was smiling. Probably, Isaac agreed. Want to make it again? She laughed and kissed him, and for a while the debts and the struggles and the uncertain future didn't matter. There was just this. Two people finding each other in the middle of the desert, building something real out of hope and hard work. But reality had a way of intruding, and it did so 3 days later when a man from the bank rode out to Beatrice's ranch. Isaac was there, working on reinforcing the corral when the banker arrived. He was a thin man with a sour expression, dressed too formally for the desert heat. "Mrs. Graves," he said, not bothering to dismount. "I'm here to inform you that the bank has decided to accelerate the timeline on your loan. We'll need full payment within 2 weeks, or we'll be forced to foreclose." Beatrice's face went pale. 2 weeks? But you said I had until the end of next month. The board has reconsidered given the recent fire and the condition of your property. We don't believe you're capable of meeting your obligations, and we need to protect the bank's interests. Isaac stepped forward, anger rising hot in his chest. She's been making her payments. She's got a new barn, the stock is healthy. You've got no cause to change the terms. The banker's eyes slid over him dismissively. "And you are Isaac Randall. I own the neighboring property." "Ah, yes, the war veteran from St. Louis. I've heard about you." The way he said it made it clear he hadn't heard anything good. "This is between Mrs. Graves and the bank, Mr. Randall. It doesn't concern you." "Anything that affects my neighbor concerns me." How touching. Nevertheless, the decision stands. 2 weeks, Mrs. Graves. "We'll expect full payment, or you'll need to vacate the property." He rode away, leaving them standing in silence. Beatrice was trembling, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "How much?" Isaac asked quietly. $800. "I've got maybe 200 if I sell every head of cattle I have left, and that would leave me with nothing to rebuild with even if I could keep the land. $800. It was a fortune, more money than most people saw in years. Isaac had some savings, money he'd put aside from his work back east and from selling his mother's house after she died. But not that much, not nearly that much. There has to be something we can do, he said. We could talk to a lawyer, see if they can legally change the terms like that. Lawyers cost money I don't have, and even if they can't legally do it, they've got all the power here. They could make things difficult enough that I'd lose the place anyway. Isaac pulled her into his arms, feeling her shake with suppressed sobs. We'll figure something out. I promise you, we'll figure something out. But as the days passed, figuring something out proved harder than he'd hoped. Isaac sold some of his tools and equipment, raising another $100. Beatrice sold her cattle, getting less than they were worth from ranchers who knew she was desperate. They still came up nearly $400 short. I could talk to Fletcher, Isaac suggested one evening as they sat on his porch, watching the sunset and trying not to think about the deadline looming over them. He seems like a decent man. Maybe he'd be willing to lend us the money. And how would we pay him back? Isaac, we're barely scraping by as it is. Taking on more debt isn't the answer. So what is? We just give up. Let them take your land. Maybe that's what I should do. Her voice was tired, defeated in a way he'd never heard before. Maybe I've been fighting for something that was already lost. I could find work in town or move somewhere else, start over. Is that what you want? No, but sometimes what we want and what we can have are two different things. Isaac stood, pacing to the edge of the porch and back. I won't accept that. There has to be a way. Isaac. She stood too, taking his hands in hers. I love you. I know we haven't said it in so many words, but I do. These last few weeks with you have been the happiest I've been in longer than I can remember, but I won't drag you down with me. You've got your own place, your own future. You need to protect that. My future is with you. Don't you understand that? The ranch, the land, none of it means anything if you're not there. She kissed him, soft and sad. That's beautiful, but it doesn't change the math. We're $400 short and we're out of time. That night, Isaac lay awake staring at the ceiling of his small house, his mind racing through possibilities and discarding them just as quickly. He could rob a bank, but he'd likely get killed or arrested, which wouldn't help Beatrice at all. He could try to buy her land himself when the bank foreclosed, but he didn't have that kind of money either. He could. The idea, when it came, was so simple he almost laughed. The railroad. They'd been wanting to expand their lines through this area, had been buying up land and rights of way. Isaac had turned down their offers for his property, not interested in selling. But what if he sold them a portion of his land? Just enough to run their tracks through, nothing that would interfere with his horse operation. It might raise enough money to save Beatrice's ranch. The next morning, he rode into town before the sun was fully up and sent a telegram to the railroad office in Tucson. The response came back that afternoon. They were interested. An agent could be there in 3 days to assess the property and make an offer. Isaac didn't tell Beatrice. He didn't want to raise her hopes in case it fell through. Instead, he spent those 3 days in an agony of waiting, maintaining the pretense of normality while inside he was tied in knots. The railroad agent arrived on schedule, a brisk businessman named Morrison who walked Isaac's property with an appraising eye. The route we're planning would run along your western edge, he explained. We'd need about 20 acres plus an easement for access and maintenance. And what are you offering? Isaac asked, his mouth dry. Morrison named a figure. $600. It wasn't quite enough, but combined with what they'd already scraped together, it would be close. Very close. I need $700, Isaac said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. The land is worth it. You know it is. Good access, level ground, and I'm not going to drag out negotiations. You give me 700 and I'll sign whatever papers you need today. Morrison considered, then nodded. 700. But I'll need a survey done first, make sure the land is what you claim. How long will that take? 3 days, maybe 4. 4 days. The bank's deadline was in 5. It would be tight, but it could work. Do it, Isaac said. He told Beatrice that evening as they sat by the creek that ran between their properties. She listened in silence as he explained about the railroad, the sale, the timing. You're selling part of your land to save mine, she said finally. Isaac, I can't let you do that. You can't stop me. It's my land to sell. But it's your future. What if you need that land later? What if selling it ruins your plans? My plans include you. Everything else is negotiable. He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. Beatrice, I came out here to build a new life. I found more than I ever dreamed of. I found you. 20 acres is a small price to pay for that. She was crying, tears sliding down her cheeks and dripping onto their joined hands. I don't deserve you. That's where you're wrong. You deserve everything good this world has to offer. You deserve happiness and security and someone who loves you enough to move heaven and earth to keep you safe. And if I can only manage to sell some land to a railroad, well, I'll just have to keep trying to be worthy of you. She kissed him then, fierce and desperate and full of hope. When this is over, when we've saved the ranch, I want to marry you, if you'll still have me. If I'll still have you, Isaac laughed, pulling her close. Beatrice Graves, I'd marry you right this second if we could find a preacher. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The next 3 days were the longest of Isaac's life. The surveyors came and did their work, confirming the land was as good as he'd claimed. The paperwork was drawn up, reviewed, and signed. And finally, on the 4th day, Morrison handed Isaac a bank draft for $700. The morning of the deadline, Isaac and Beatrice rode into Taylor together. They'd gathered every penny they could scrape together, combining his railroad money with the proceeds from selling her cattle and his equipment. It came to exactly $815. Not much of a cushion, but enough. The banker's expression when they walked in together, Isaac carrying a satchel full of cash and bank drafts, was worth the stress of the last few weeks. His eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline, and he actually stammered when he spoke. Mrs. Graves. Mr. Randall, I wasn't expecting you. We're here to make the payment, Beatrice said, her voice cool and steady. Full payment on the loan as required. They counted out the money together, Isaac and Beatrice standing shoulder to shoulder as the banker verified each bill and draft. When the last dollar was accounted for, he had no choice but to stamp the papers and hand Beatrice the receipt. The land is paid off, he said, clearly forcing the words out. Congratulations, Mrs. Graves. Thank you, she said calmly. Then, with a smile that could have melted steel, she added, I trust the bank won't be accelerating any more deadlines without proper legal justification. The banker's face reddened. Of course not. That was simply a matter of protecting our interests. Of course, Beatrice echoed, her tone making clear she knew exactly what it had been. They walked out of the bank together, and it wasn't until they were out of sight of the windows that Beatrice let out a whoop of joy that startled a passing dog. She threw her arms around Isaac's neck, laughing and crying at the same time. We did it. Isaac, we actually did it. He spun her around, not caring who saw, not caring what anyone thought. You did it. You fought for your home and you won. We won. There's no me without you anymore. Don't you understand that? He understood perfectly. He kissed her right there on the main street of Taylor, Arizona territory, and let the whole town talk. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church Isaac had noticed his first day in town. It was a simple ceremony, attended by a handful of townspeople and Tom Fletcher, who'd become something of a friend. Beatrice wore a simple blue dress she'd made herself, and Isaac wore his one good suit. The preacher, an elderly man with kind eyes, pronounced them husband and wife, and when Isaac kissed his bride, he felt like the luckiest man alive. Their honeymoon consisted of 2 days alone at Isaac's ranch, which they'd decided would become their main residence since the house was in better shape. They spent the time making plans for the future, talking about combining their herds, expanding the horse breeding operation, maybe even having children someday. "I never thought I'd want that again," Beatrice admitted as they lay together under the stars, too happy to sleep. "After James died, I thought that part of my life was over, but with you I can imagine it, a family, a real partnership. We'll take it one day at a time," Isaac said, holding her close. "No rush, no pressure, we've got all the time in the world." But life on a ranch didn't allow for much lingering on honeymoon bliss. There was work to be done, and they threw themselves into it with renewed energy. They combined their resources, with Beatrice's cattle grazing on the best pasture while Isaac focused on building up a string of quality horses. The railroad's presence brought new opportunities, with workers needing mounts and the expanding towns requiring transportation. 4 months after their wedding, a horse buyer from the army came through, looking to purchase mounts for the cavalry. Isaac showed him the stock he'd been training, and the man was impressed enough to buy 6 horses on the spot and place an order for 20 more to be delivered over the next year. "You've got a good eye," the buyer told Isaac as they shook hands on the deal. "These are quality animals, well trained and sound. I'll be back." That night, Isaac and Beatrice celebrated with a bottle of wine Tom Fletcher had given them as a wedding present. They sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and red. "Do you ever regret it?" Beatrice asked. "Leaving St. Louis, coming out here, getting tangled up with a stubborn widow and her failing ranch," Isaac pretended to consider. "Well, the work is harder, the hours are longer, and the heat is murderous. So no, not for a single second." She laughed and leaned against his shoulder. "I'm glad, because I can't imagine my life without you now. You saved more than my ranch, Isaac. You saved me." "We saved each other," he corrected. "I was just going through the motions before I met you. Now I'm living." As winter settled over the territory, they worked on improving both properties. They built a proper barn on Beatrice's old place and started using it for hay storage and equipment. They repaired all the fences, ensuring their stock wouldn't wander. They even installed a new windmill that pumped water more efficiently than the old one. On Christmas morning, Beatrice woke Isaac before dawn with a kiss and a whispered secret. She was pregnant. They were going to have a baby. Isaac couldn't speak for a moment, overwhelmed by a rush of joy and terror. A child, their child, a new life they'd created together. "Are you happy?" Beatrice asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Isaac managed. Terrified, thrilled, grateful, amazed. "But yes, happy most of all." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Beatrice continued to work right up until the last few weeks, despite Isaac's worried protests. She was strong and healthy, and the doctor in town assured them everything was developing normally. Their son was born on a cool evening in early September, as the worst of the summer heat was finally breaking. He came into the world squalling with indignation, and Isaac fell in love the moment he saw that tiny red face. They named him Henry after Isaac's father, and James for Beatrice's first husband, because she wanted to honor the past even as they built the future. Holding his son for the first time, Isaac felt something he'd never expected to feel again after the war: complete peace. This was what he'd been searching for, what he'd traveled across half the country to find. Not land or fortune or glory, but this: family, home, love. As Henry grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. The army contract led to others, and Isaac's reputation as a horse trainer spread throughout the territory. Beatrice managed the cattle operation with the same fierce competence she brought to everything, and together they built something solid and lasting. When Henry was 2, they welcomed a daughter, Sarah, who had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She was followed 3 years later by another son, William, who was quiet and thoughtful from the day he was born. The house had to be expanded to accommodate their growing family, and Isaac took pleasure in every board he nailed, every room he added. This was his legacy, built with his own hands, filled with people he loved more than life itself. One evening, when Henry was 7 and already showing promise with horses, Beatrice and Isaac sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. The ranch stretched out around them, prosperous and well-maintained, a far cry from the struggling properties they'd started with. "Do you remember when we met?" Beatrice asked, taking Isaac's hand. "You were so determined to keep to yourself, to not get involved." "And you were so determined to handle everything alone," Isaac replied. "We were both fools, but we got better. We did." "Thanks to a barn fire and some stubborn pride," Beatrice laughed. "I prefer to think it was fate. You bought the ranch next door, not knowing the widow came with the land, but she did, and here we are." "Here we are," Isaac agreed, pulling her close, "and I wouldn't change a single moment of it." As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Isaac looked at the life he'd built and felt nothing but gratitude. He'd come west broken and searching, and he'd found healing in the most unexpected place, in a widow with proud shoulders and worried eyes. In hard work and honest effort, in partnership and love, the railroad had expanded, bringing more people and more opportunities to the territory. Taylor had grown from a handful of buildings to a proper town with a school, a hotel, and even a newspaper. The West was changing, becoming more civilized, but there was still plenty of wildness left for those who knew where to look. Their children grew up learning to ride and rope, to value hard work and honest dealing. Henry became a renowned horse trainer in his own right, working alongside his father. Sarah, to everyone's surprise, showed a gift for business and ended up managing the financial side of their expanding operation. William became a teacher, opening a school in Taylor and educating the next generation of frontier children. As Isaac and Beatrice grew older, they slowly turned over more of the daily operations to their children. They'd earned the right to slow down, to enjoy the fruits of decades of hard labor. But neither of them could quite give up the work entirely. Isaac could still be found in the corrals most mornings, working with the young horses. Beatrice still rode out to check on the cattle, her eye as sharp as ever. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, and the party lasted well into the night. When it was finally over and everyone had gone home, Isaac and Beatrice walked down to the creek that had first brought them together. 25 years, Beatrice marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like forever. The best kind of forever, Isaac said. The kind filled with you. She leaned against him, comfortable and familiar and still the most beautiful woman he'd ever known. I love you, Isaac Randall. Thank you for saving my ranch. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for this life. Thank you for letting me, he whispered, for taking a chance on a broken veteran who didn't know what he was doing, for building this life with me. They stood there in the darkness, listening to the water flow over the rocks, the same creek that had given them both life in this harsh land. The same creek that had brought them together and sustained them through everything that followed. Years continued to pass, as they always do. Isaac and Beatrice celebrated their 30th anniversary, then their 40th. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents. The ranch continued to thrive under their children's management, expanding into one of the most successful operations in the territory. When Arizona became a state in 1912, Isaac and Beatrice were there in Phoenix to see it happen, elderly now but still sharp and engaged with the world. They'd lived through the transformation of the West from wild frontier to modern civilization, and while Isaac sometimes missed the simplicity of those early days, he couldn't argue with progress. They died within 6 months of each other, Isaac first at the age of 84, and Beatrice following as if she couldn't bear to be parted from him for long. They were buried on a hill overlooking both their original properties, the land they'd fought so hard to keep and build into something lasting. Their great-grandson stood at the funeral, looking out over the ranch that still bore their name, and told the story of how it all began. A stranger riding into town, a widow fighting to save her home, a barn fire that brought them together, love that grew from partnership and mutual respect into something eternal. They built all this, he told the gathered mourners, not just the ranch but a legacy. They taught us that strength comes from working together, that love is action, not just words, that when you find something worth fighting for, you hold on with everything you have. And in the years that followed, their descendants did exactly that. They held on, they built, they loved. The ranch remained in the family for generations, a testament to what two people could accomplish when they refused to give up on each other or the land they loved. The creek still ran between the properties, the same water that had sustained Isaac and Beatrice in those early, desperate days. The house they'd built and expanded still stood, weathered but solid. And somewhere in the desert wind, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the echo of laughter, of two people who'd found each other against all odds and built a love story that would outlast them both. Isaac Randall had bought a ranch, not knowing the widow came with the land. But Beatrice Graves had given him something far more valuable than property. She'd given him purpose, partnership, and a love that had sustained him through every trial and triumph. She'd given him a reason to live instead of just survive, and in return, he'd given her the same. Two broken people, piecing themselves back together through hard work and harder love, building something beautiful out of dust and determination and desperate hope. It was more than either of them had expected that day when Isaac rode into Taylor, more than they'd dreamed of when Beatrice rode over to introduce herself to her new neighbor. But it was exactly what they'd both needed, even if they hadn't known it at the time. Their story became legend in Taylor, passed down through generations. The stranger and the widow, the barn fire that brought them together, the fight to save the land, the love that conquered every obstacle. It was the kind of story people told on winter evenings, the kind that gave hope to anyone facing impossible odds. Because if Isaac and Beatrice could do it, if they could take two failing ranches and turn them into an empire, if they could find love in the middle of loss and hardship, then anything was possible. Any dream could be achieved with enough determination and the right partner by your side. The sun set over the Arizona desert one final time on the day of Beatrice's funeral, painting the sky in the colors Isaac had always loved. And as her great-grandchildren gathered on the porch of the house she'd shared with Isaac for over 50 years, someone started telling the story again. The story of how it all began, of a man who bought a ranch, of a woman who came with the land, of a love that built an empire and changed the desert forever. And in the telling, Isaac and Beatrice lived again, young and strong and fighting for their future. Forever preserved in the story of the stranger and the widow, the cowboy and his love, the two people who'd found each other in the Wild West and refused to let go. Their legacy lived on, not just in the land they'd preserved and the empire they'd built, but in the lesson they'd taught everyone who came after. That love was worth fighting for. That partnership was stronger than pride. That sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected places. Isaac had bought the ranch next door, not knowing the widow came with the land. But in the end, it was the widow, not the land, who'd made all the difference. She was the treasure he'd never known he was searching for, the answer to questions he'd been too afraid to ask. And together, they'd written a love story worthy of the Wild West itself, full of danger and determination, hardship and hope, and a love that had lasted not just a lifetime, but generations beyond. A love that would echo through the ages, as long as anyone remembered the name Randall, or the ranch they'd built together in the Arizona desert. The end of their story was really just the beginning of a legacy that would endure as long as the land itself. And somewhere, in whatever came after, Isaac and Beatrice were together still, probably arguing about the best way to break a horse or manage a herd, still partners, still in love, still building their forever one day at a time.